And I'm guessing not many people here know anything or much about Irish travellers. And in 2017, we were recognised as an ethnic minority in our own country, which is kind of strange because ethnic to me and always has been is someone that came from outside the lands. So if you're in America, you could say African Americans are an ethnic minority because they were taken from another continent. If you're in Ireland, you would say Roma are an ethnic minority because they came from a different country. So how would the people who are indigenous to the island end up as an ethnic minority? And you've been listening to some history this morning about the invasions, colonisation, and all of that. What a lot of people around the world don't know is that Ireland was colonised for 800 years. But what many people don't know is that Ireland also became psychologically colonised. In other words, it went from the physical colonisation to the psychological colonisation, which was planned by the English at a very early stage. They believed in changing the psyche of the Irish people into an English colonial mindset. So in 2017, as I mentioned, part of a lot of campaign and lobbying and protesting, and thanks to the EU human rights organisations, have put pressure on Ireland to recognise our community as a distinct culture. Because when people hear travellers and settled, they assume it's Irish people. And one group of Irish people seem to be wandering around aimlessly, and the other group of Irish people live in a house. But it's far more complex than that. It's psychological, as I just previously mentioned about Ireland being psychologically colonised. And how we know this is in 1922, when Ireland got its independence. Ireland remained with all of the old English systems. You might have heard of Trinity College, Maynooth College, King's Inn College in Dublin. They're all English institutions in Ireland to this present day. So the truth who we are is an indigenous people, part of the last of the Gaelic clans. Now if you go to Dublin and most other places, they will tell you that the Gaelic world died 400 years ago when O'Neill had left. But that's not true. So in 2017, a lot of pressure I mentioned about a recognition, because we have children now at 9 years old committing suicide because the dominant group, the people who proclaim themselves to be the normal default Irish, do not recognise their own people, do not recognise their own history. And as I mentioned, we got labelled ethnic and all these other labels.
Thank you for making time in the House today for this historic and symbolic recognition of travellers as an ethnic group. Our traveller community is an integral part of our society for over 1,000 years, with their own distinct identity, people within our people. Together we agreed that recognition of travellers could have a transformative effect on relations between travellers and the wider society, and will create no new individual, no new constitutional or no new financial rights, because of course travellers already enjoy all the human rights and responsibilities that are afforded for all people under our constitution and laws.
So this was Enda Kenny. He was the leader of the Fine Gael political party, leader of the country at the time. And as I mentioned, a lot of campaigning, lobbying to get them recognised travellers as a distinct culture. They weren't particularly happy about it because they did not want the world to know that there was a distinct culture on the island of Ireland. Because if there was a distinct culture on the island of Ireland, who were these people? How could they be the normal default Irish if there was an indigenous culture on the island? So all the pressures brought into ethnic recognition. This is a health report taken, I think it was 2010, because in Ireland they don't do too much of that. They'd rather tell us that settled people hate us, they don't want us working with them, they don't want us living in their areas and so on and so forth. And as I mentioned, this was about 10 years ago. Now we have children who's 9, 10 and 11 committing suicide because Ireland has a psychological issue. It believes themselves to be Irish independent. In other words, they're normal default Irish, and somehow or another nobody knows who we are. even in the finest of universities, when you go to ask them, they say, we have no written history. There's no proof you existed here. This is why we ended up Traveller and Roma, which are two completely different cultures, two completely different origins. And
Funny, man.
the guy who comes up next uses a swear word, so I'll give you a heads up. But what happened is that the Irish scholars, the educated people, were telling people around the world that we were related to the Roma, and we didn't know who they were. So this is a guy called Aldous Reed Jr., American political scientist. It's a very short clip, but it'll give you an indication when we're talking about how contained we are in this country, that the world doesn't know about it.
Funny, man. Like I have actually read people, scholars supposedly, who have tried to argue that travelers are in fact Roma. And I thought, come on, how fucking ridiculous can that be, right? I mean, whoever just make it up, right?
It's quite interesting because that's exactly what they did. They made it up. In 2018, Ireland had its history written by Cambridge University in England. So when people, these 6 volumes and 12 volumes of history goes around the world and people are reading it, they're actually reading Irish history from Cambridge University in England's version of Irish history. So you can see how we get lost in all of this. Travellers, Michael McDonough, rest his soul, many other travellers have been saying what they thought was common sense. You know, we've been here forever. Traveller history is Irish history is traveller history. None of the travellers could make any sense of why the settled people with the same skin complexion on the same island, in some cases, most cases, people with the same surnames were coming up asking us about our culture and our identity. And when they didn't like it, of course, unfortunately, we went through many years of persecution. This would be Nan Joyce also, who had passed, and she would say, again, we were the people that had been excluded for the last 100 years. So we found it very difficult to prove who we were. To say to them, look, we know who we are. They said, well, how do you know? How can you prove it? You've no facts, you've no evidence. So people were telling them they've been here for generations after generations after generations. Now, this guy is not talking, which he should be talking.
That the
Not sure what's happening there. Unfortunately, he's not playing. This is the archaeologist Dylan Foley. He's a friend of mine. He works in TraVision Foundation with myself and others. Here, what you're looking at is a map of Ireland. You can see all these little wiggly things here. They're not counties. You know, you got County Limerick, County Sligo, County Cork. Well, all the counties were an English construct. They weren't a Gaelic Ireland. So what you would have here, like in 1450, is all of these. But unfortunately, that's not playing. And what Dylan was talking about here was that from an archaeologist's perspective, it is impossible that people who call themselves settled Irish today would have gone back into the Gaelic world, because when the English came here in the 12th century, in the 16th century, they had colonised the whole island. I had mentioned earlier on about Trinity College in King's End. They're all English institutions. And yeah, unfortunately, that's not playing. I apologise about that.
microbiome.
The next guy up is a professor of science, microbiome. It took me a while to pronounce that word. It's called microbiome or something. But it's microbiome. It's a good bacteria. It's a bacteria that lives inside us and around us. It's an ancient microbiome that's been found on travellers, distinct from the settled people. So I just...
That the microbiome of the settled community is the one that's changed. I think the travellers have retained an ancient microbiome. And I do suspect that my microbiome, my ancestors' microbiome particularly, centuries ago, might have looked a bit like a traveller's microbiome, but with modernisation and with the settled community, the elements of life that we may not even know about seem to have changed that microbiome.
So, what Fergus Shanahan, professor, is saying that if he believes if we went back several generations, maybe 300-400 years ago, the microbiome we have today would be similar to his ancestors. So obviously something happened several centuries or several generations or 15 generations ago. And we know that when the English came here, they colonised, they othered people, they pushed people into the west of Ireland. Dublin, which gets away very lightly, unfortunately, plays the victim of being the victim of English colonisation. I'm not sure if many people actually know that Dublin was the English Empire. It was a frontier that was here in Ireland. So in 1847, which is a date most people know about, 1847 was the time of what they call the Great Famine. And some people get upset and they say it was a genocide, and other people say it's not a genocide, that it was accidental and so on and so forth. But in Dublin in 1847, they wrote an act, and the act was called the Vagrancy Act, and what this did was trap people in their homes. So if people who were starving to death were to move, they could be beaten, they could be transported and arrested. So when people say, was it a famine or a genocide, it's a mix of both. Unfortunately, Dublin again continues to play the victim. Not throwing poor Dublin under the bus, because history is complex, but history for the settled people is something that happened in a linear kind of line, something that once happened. History for Irish travellers is something that's still happening, so we don't make that distinction. And again, just travellers continuously saying throughout the decades, what made it impossible for travellers to convey their story was the absence of science. So when we had archaeologists and various professors come along, we've spoken to universities, we have geneticists, we have microbiome, and all of these guys are telling us, yeah, it makes sense what you're saying, it stands up. And this is, which is not playing either, sorry about that. Again, we're back to Ferguson, and he's telling us that it was the settled people who had changed, that it wasn't the travellers. In other words, in the science at the moment, they'll say that travellers had diverged from the settled population, as if somehow or another we were rejects, or we were a lesser group and they were a superior group. But as the scientists are telling us, it's the other way around. The people who call themselves the Irish actually came from our old world and not the other way around.
Involved in a number of...
This is Jim Wilson. Jim Wilson is a scientist with the Edinburgh University, and he worked with travellers and he done the geneticists. So again, sounds all kind of silly to even saying this kind of stuff, but we're in a country on an island where they try to convince you when you're a child that you're not from here, that they're the normal Irish and you're not the normal Irish. And yeah, it took decades to get this across.
Involved in a number of studies, the Irish traveller study and of some of Irish settled people. I think it's a very important discovery to see clearly that the Irish travellers had Irish roots. So I'm going to explain that a little bit for a second, because I think it's important to understand. There's one thing first, is that this estimation of the time of divergence comes with quite a wide confidence. So our best estimate was 360 years, but it may be longer. I personally think it could well be longer, but that's not how long the traveller lineages have been in Ireland. The traveller lineages that we saw, many of them were about 4,000 years old, and they had been in Ireland for that long. They were able to take over to such a degree the Stone Age people who were there before. So that's where the majority of the roots of Scottish people, of the settled Irish people, and of the Irish travellers go back all that way.
So, as you can see, science tells us we've been here a very long time, and we did come from the same gene pool at one stage as the people who call themselves settled Irish now. And these are labels. We're called Irish travellers, but we're also called itinerants, we're also called thinkers, we're also called various other labels. But each time you go back into the past, you go into a Gaelic world, a Gaelic society. And most of us come from Gaelic clans, particularly in the west of Ireland. So I say all of this because I've grown up around death, destitute, suicides, and there isn't a traveller now at the present moment. Issues we have now, we didn't have 60 years ago, let alone 200 years ago. It's because Ireland became popular in the 1960s. They wanted to show off to the Americans, tell them how Irish we are, and we fended off a big bad old empire, and that was all grand. The only thing that was contradicting their story and their narrative was it was a group of people, roughly around 40 to 50,000 people now. But we go back through the decades and the centuries. We were once the millions. We were the Gaelic society both in Scotland, Wales, Ireland and other parts. So I don't want to throw the settled people under a bus, but when they're telling the world that they are the default Irish, they're actually psychologically colonised, because, as I mentioned, they've never changed any of the institutions. They've been running on a foundation that has not changed since the 16th century. And as Jim had mentioned, there was a divergence. The divergence was about 360 years ago, which was the time of the conquest. So eventually, the English came here, broke the Gaelic order down, assimilated people over the generations, over the centuries. And Irish travellers were pretty much the last people in that door. The people who weren't fully assimilated, fully colonised. And unfortunately, none of this history is common knowledge in Ireland. Because I think some people have a level of shame. They don't want to know about it, they don't want to hear about it, because they feel that they've went through enough, and why go down that path again. So I'm not sure if, I'm sorry, I do apologise for the videos not playing. And yeah, I think if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. And thank you very much.